Hey everybody, welcome to Crazy Tech Lab, and also welcome to those of you joining from over on Forbes as well. And today it's the big one because I have the Ryzen 9 5950X, which is right here, courtesy of AMD. Thanks guys for sending it over. And it's its new flagship Zen 3 16-core 32-thread CPU. So this guy is basically the successor to the Ryzen 9 3950X. And what I'm hoping, it's super interesting to say this, but we are potentially looking at a no-compromise product here, a no-compromise CPU, a processor that's great at everything, and that's very, very rare in the CPU world. If you haven't realized that already, if you look at Intel's product stack, for example, it's got the Core i9 10900K, awesome at gaming performance, reasonable multi-threaded performance, but it only has 10 cores and 20 threads. The other end of the spectrum at Intel's, on Intel's high-end desktop platform is the Core i9 10980XE, which has 18 cores and 36 threads. Obviously a bit of a monster when it comes to multi-threaded workloads. It's also a great overclocker, but it wasn't anywhere near as good in games as the 10900K. So kind of a really interesting prospect there then, and it's, as I said, it's super rare in the CPU world to have a CPU that's pretty much the best at everything. I think in terms of content creation, we're going to be looking at the new king here. The Ryzen 9 5900X was already an absolute monster. However, the Zen 2 architecture and even the Ryzen 9 3950X with its high boosting frequencies was not the fastest in games. It was pretty much the fastest in games like Far Cry 5 out of AMD's product stack, but it wasn't as good as Intel. Ryzen CPUs have offered great value for games, but they haven't always been the fastest. So that remit has always been Intel's remit. If you want the fastest at everything and you're splashing out on a really high power graphics card and you're gaming at really high frame rates in games that are potentially CPU limited in those situations, you would need to go for an Intel CPU. However, Zen 3 has completely smashed that idea. We now have CPUs from AMD that are as fast, if not faster than Intel in games. And that's great because it means that AMD finally can really cash in on the fact that it has great multi-threaded performance as well. And as I mentioned, we are potentially looking at an all-conquering product here. So specifications then, we've already talked about the single core boost, but the all-core boost that I observed is quite a bit lower than 4.9 gigahertz. So that's all to do with the TDP, and this is something I get asked a lot with the 16 cores, is how come this product has a TDP of 105 watts, which is the same as the Ryzen 7 5800X, which only has 8 cores. So 8 cores, 16 cores, same TDP. How does that work? Well, what AMD has to do then is to rein in that all-core boost, and what we're looking at is 3.8 gigahertz on the all-core boost. That's what I observed with my system. So it has to do that to keep the thermal limit and the power limit of 105 watts within specification. If it put the cores all up to the same frequency, it would obviously be a bit of a monster, drawing a lot more power than the 5800X. So the downside obviously is that climb down to 3.8 gigahertz, and the gap between the one core at 4.9 gigahertz and 16 cores at 3.8 is fairly large. So what's going to be happening in between there is basically going to dictate how fast this CPU performs in moderately threaded workloads compared to its siblings, because they are already really, really fast. They can boost up to 4.4, 4.5 gigahertz all-core in moderately threaded workloads, or actually in fully multi-threaded workloads. So when all cores are loaded, they're hitting some pretty high frequencies. So other specifications then are the 64 megabyte L3 cache. Obviously got both 8-core CCXs enabled, so you get the full whack of cache. You also get the full whack of L2 cache because we've got 16 cores, so I think it's 512 kilobytes per core L2 cache, so you get the full whack of 8 megabytes. So the cooler, there is no cooler. Empty box, as you get with the Ryzen 9 5900X and 5800X. You're looking at an $800 CPU here, so it's right. I think AMD's within its rights not to provide a cooler with the CPU. They expect you to go out and buy your own. However, the benefit is that you're, at stock speed at least, you're still dealing with a 105 watt CPU, so you don't need crazy cooling. And that also means that you don't really need a crazy motherboard to run this CPU either. I mean, dinky things like this, the Crosshair 8 Impact from Asus, absolutely gorgeous board, as are most Mini ITX motherboards in my eyes. They're more than capable of handling the CPU, which is amazing news. So I will be putting some cooler links, or links to coolers, should I say, down in the description below, so you can pick out some recommended coolers for this CPU if you're going to be buying it. Also, for other CPUs, such as the 5600X and everything else, you can see some coolers recommended in my reviews for those, so do check those out. Both on my YouTube channel, I'll put links to them down below. And also, if you just prefer reading an article rather than listening to me ramble on about CPUs, you can see my articles for the Ryzen 5000 reviews over on Forbes as well. So a whole bunch of benchmarks to get through then, and the only thing I need to say is do subscribe to my channel, and if you like this video, do like it as well. Having your support through subscribing and liking my video does mean a lot, and it just means that I get more support and more engagement for my videos. And don't forget to turn on notifications as well to be notified when I'm uploading new videos, because I've got some crazy stuff coming in for you guys. Mini ITX builds and Mini ITX testing, and a whole bunch of features and reviews coming up. So do take a look at those. So that's it then from the specifications and talking about where this product fits into the market and everything else. So without further ado, let's crack on with those performance numbers. Okay, first up then we need to talk about overclocking, and I managed to overclock the AMD Ryzen 9 5950X to 4.6 GHz using a V-core of 1.25 volts, a little higher than what I probably stick with for a 24/7 overclock, but given that I see a lot of people running these things at more than 1.25 volts, it remains to be seen what everybody else is going to be running it at, but 1.25 isn't horrendous. But 4.6 GHz, it's absolutely huge. So that's I mean, what is that? That's like 800 megahertz higher than where it sits at stock speed. Don't forget the stock speed all-core boost sat around 3.8. So that's going to mean a huge increase for multi-threaded workloads, almost certainly. We'll look at that in a second. But the single threaded performance in Cinebench at 647 at stock speed, that's absolutely huge. But obviously that all-core overclock, that sees a climb down from 4.9, well, it was actually over that, it was over 5 gigahertz, the stock speed all-core boost. That climbs all the way down the score to 594. So clearly then, a manual overclock is going to see a reduction in single and potentially lightly threaded workload performance, but multi-threaded performance will be off the chart. So it's going to depend a lot as to what you actually want to use your PC for, as to whether you go for a manual overclock or you try your luck with precision boost overdrive and automatic overclocking. The latter certainly won't net you an all-core boost frequency of 4.6 gigahertz. You'll probably be looking at 200 megahertz at most added to the all-core boost, so you're still going to be losing out on a fair bit of performance there. So compared to the other CPUs in the test, the Ryzen 9 5900X obviously nearly as fast, but not quite, because it didn't boost quite as high as the CPU, but the 3950X all the way down there at 538 points. So that's a huge increase in single-threaded performance for AMD here, and I think that's one of the biggest I've ever seen for a predecessor of a CPU versus the new model. An increase of over 100 points there in Cinebench. And the 10900K then, the single-threaded performance of 520, even bigger margin compared to the Ryzen 9 3950X. The 10980XE, the Core i9, all the way down at the bottom. I don't think there's a more stark reminder just how far behind Intel is in some respects. The Core i9 10980XE, obviously 18 cores, 36 threads. It's pretty potent in multi-threaded performance, but that single-threaded and lightly threaded performance really is lacking, and a 200-point difference between the 5950X and the 10980XE, complete opposite ends of the graph. So that's quite telling, isn't it? So let's move on to the next benchmark. So next up is the multi-threaded test in Cinebench, and as expected, the AMD Ryzen 9 5950X absolutely flies in this benchmark. We're looking at a near 1,000-point increase over the 3950X from one generation to another. That's pretty significant, and once overclocked, it's an absolute monster. So that 4.6 gigahertz manual overclock saw the score rise to almost 12,000 points, which is miles ahead of any other CPU. In fact, the Threadripper 3960X only gets a couple of thousand points more than that, which goes to show just how amazing the Zen 3 architecture is. 3950X, as I say, about 1,000 points down. The 10980XE about 1,500 points down at stock speed. Big increase from when you overclock it, but it only manages to match the 3950X's stock speed result. Okay, next up then is Handbrake, and once again the Ryzen 9 5950X sits at the top of the graph. We're looking at reasonable gains over the rest of the competition, but the 5950X obviously 16 cores. Handbrake doesn't scale that well above 8 or 10 cores, I believe, so diminishing returns compared to the other Ryzen 5000 series CPUs. The Ryzen 7 5800X, for example, 111 frames per second, so you're still seeing a pretty sizable drop in the encoding time compared to that CPU, but the 5900X just 5 seconds knocked off that benchmark time. That's well less than 10%. So 5950X probably not worth it unless you're encoding videos every day, all day, every day. But still some significant gains over the Ryzen 9 3950X. 87 seconds versus 76 seconds. That's purely down to the architecture alone. And the Core i9 10980XE, significant gains over that one at stock speed, but the Intel CPU did manage to match the 5950X once overclocked, but with a huge power consumption, which you can see later on in the benchmarks. Next up then is Adobe Premiere Pro, and I should add that this benchmark now uses GPU acceleration, which massively reduces the export time, especially when you're dealing with 4K video. And it's no surprise then that the Ryzen 9 5950X doesn't really offer that much more performance than something like the Ryzen 9 3900X or Ryzen 9 5900X. Because most of the load is put onto the GPU these days. So a year or two ago, yeah, sure, you would have wanted the most powerful CPU you could afford, and the Core i9 10980XE was pretty much the best for the job. But now that the GPU acceleration massively reduces the export times, it's far better to actually go for a decent graphics card than a massively powerful processor here. So the 10980XE, not really that much slower, a couple of seconds at stock speed, but matched the AMD CPU when overclocked. And really anything, pretty much anything in the graph is not that far behind the 5950X. As soon as you start to hit sort of 10 cores or more, the results are very, very similar. And in fact, even the Ryzen 5 5600X managed to stick with the likes of the Ryzen 7 5800X. There's pretty much the margin of error that I'd expect in this benchmark between the vast majority of the CPUs here. The only exception may be the Ryzen 7 3800X at 65 frames per second. For some reason, it was slightly slower than the Ryzen 5 3600X, but overall, it is a win for AMD, I'd say, in this situation, but not worth considering the 5950X over most of the other CPUs in the test if you've got a decent GPU for that GPU acceleration. The next benchmark then is PC Mark 10's image editing test, and this is based on the GIMP image editing program. And AMD are usually pretty favorable here. It is a multi-threaded benchmark, and the Ryzen 9 5950X there with the top scores at both stock speed and overclocked. 5900X not far behind though, and the 5800X really kind of performing quite well given its 8-core 16-thread deficit. Ryzen 9 3900X performed pretty well as well, and you have to go way down the graph to the 10900K from Intel, which managed 17,000 to see the Intel, the next Intel result there. The Core i9 10980XE only managed 16,000 at stock speed, so well down on the 5950X, but did claw back a reasonable amount of performance, close to 20,000 points once overclocked, so that's kind of on par with the Ryzen 7 5800X. But again, AMD reigns supreme in this test, so if you're a big GIMP user, then AMD is definitely the way to go. I will be looking at other software in the future, but for now, it's all about GIMP, and AMD has by far and away the most powerful processors for this software. So moving on to our first game test now then, and Wolfenstein Youngblood usually sees a really good performance from AMD's Ryzen 5000 series CPUs. It was pretty much the same for the Ryzen 9 5900X, but it was down compared to the likes of the Ryzen 5 5600X. So you're looking at a minimum 99th percentile of 182 frames per second versus, 200 frames per second for the 5600X. So that's possibly that TDP coming into play, kicking back the boosting frequency at stock speed. But interestingly, overclocking the CPU didn't seem to help that much either. In fact, the CPU was actually slower. So it seems that those CPUs with lower TDPs and can keep those high frequency boosts for longer across more cores. It does seem to be that those CPUs are slightly better in this test, and I did rerun this benchmark a couple of times with several CPUs, but I got the same results. So kind of surprising there, but again, the Ryzen 9 5950X, it's still on par with the Core i9 10900K. That CPU managed a minimum 99th percentile of 192, so 10 frames per second behind. But given that we've got the RTX 3080 at the helm here, and at 1080p, that's really pushing things to kind of extreme levels in terms of CPU throttling. At higher resolutions or with less powerful graphics cards, there'll be less of a difference there. So pretty much on par with Intel in this test. Obviously, the average frame rate of 255 frames per second was actually faster than the 10900K, so kind of even Steven there for the 5950X versus the 10900K. But really, if you want to save some cash here, AMD's cheaper Ryzen 5000 series CPUs with fewer cores are probably the way to go. Next up is Metro Exodus, again at 1080p with RTX features enabled in this game, and the Ryzen 9 5950X with a minimum 99th percentile of 57 frames per second. That pretty much matches most other Ryzen 5 5000 series CPUs. It's the same with the Ryzen 9 5900X, for example. The Core i9 10900K at stock speed, 59 frames per second on the minimum, so a couple of frames ahead. And it was the same on the average as well, but that's almost within the margin of error that I'd expect from this game. It is pretty consistent, but not that much gained by opting for Intel's flagship gaming processor. Once overclocked, Intel gained a couple of frames per second, but really not that much. The 10980XE at stock speed languishing well down there in the graphs. So once again, it just goes to show what a well-rounded CPU the Ryzen 9 5950X is. And doesn't seem to lose out that much more performance compared to its siblings either. It's actually faster at stock speed than the Ryzen 5 5600X, which is good news, kind of the opposite of what happened in Wolfenstein Youngblood. Once overclocked, again, the CPU was a tad slower, a couple of frames per second on the average frame rate, but managed the same minimum 99th percentile. Our final game test then is Far Cry New Dawn, and this tends to be one where AMD has performed pretty well. Zen 2 saw significant gains over Zen Plus in this benchmark, and it's the same with AMD. In fact, the Ryzen 9 5950X, sorry, it should be the same with Zen 3, I should say, not just AMD. So the Ryzen 9 5950X managed 109 frames per second, which is a pretty significant score. In fact, that matches the 10900K's stock speed performance, but the AMD CPU had a slightly higher average frame rate. So looking down the graphs, the next CPU is the Ryzen 9 5900X, slightly lower average, but very, very similar on the minimum. Actually, well, it's slightly slower on the minimum as well, isn't it? 106 frames per second. So more cores and or higher single core boost seem to be making the difference there. And it's pretty much the same going down the graph. So you had to go a fair way down the graph to find the Ryzen 5 5600X, 101 frames per second versus 109 on the minimum, and 155 versus 164 for the average. So some small gains there, definitely not worth opting for the Ryzen 9 5950X over the other AMD Ryzen 5000 CPUs here. The differences are quite small, but it is a win nonetheless, but just worth bearing in mind that you won't see significantly more performance. The 10980XE, obviously very, very slow in this game by comparison, well down there in, was it third from bottom. at stock speed. It did make some reasonable gains once overclocked, but nowhere near enough to give the Ryzen 9 5950X anything to worry about. Our final test then is power consumption, and while that TDP might have reduced performance in some of our tests, given those 16 cores have to stay within a 105 watt remit, the benefit of that is a very easy CPU to tame at stock speed. System draw of just 239 watts, just a couple more watts more than the Ryzen 7 5800X, which is obviously another 105 watt TDP. So pretty much staying within spec then, and that's going to mean that you won't need a massively powerful power supply to power this CPU, nor a powerful CPU cooler if you're staying at stock speed. You're looking at a similar TDP to the 8-core Ryzen 7 5800X. Once overclocked though, that power draw does increase significantly at a similar voltage to the other Ryzen 5000 series CPUs, but with 16 cores chugging along at 4.6 gigahertz, you see the power draw increase to 385 watts, which is second only to the Core i9 10980XE. However, the 10980XE are well out there in the lead with 609 watts. So given that it's still miles away from the Ryzen 9 5900X at that frequency, it's still AMD all the way here. The power efficiency of the 7nm Zen 3 architecture is pretty phenomenal. The Ryzen 9, Core i9 10900K are well out there again with a stock speed power draw of 330 watts. And given the Ryzen 9 5900X draws just 239, but matches or betters it in most games, and certainly betters it in content creation. Again, that's a pretty decent result for AMD there. And yeah, overall, Zen 3 architecture and 7nm are a pretty potent mix. So what do we make of the Ryzen 9 5950X then? Well, it's pretty much a complete and utter beast across the board. You've got stellar content creation performance, which we knew was going to be the case looking at its siblings, the likes of the 5800X and 5900X. Zen 3 has just been utterly devastating in what the added performance that we're seeing across the board. And basically, it's ticked that box completely, so we're dealing with the fastest mainstream desktop performance that you can get pretty much in content creation when when all those cores and threads are utilized, and even when they're not, it's still massively fast. In games though, we're looking at a CPU that is pretty much no compromise, just one or two instances where it drops a few frames compared to its siblings, potentially due to the fact that when you're loading all those cores and threads, or at least most of them, you're seeing a quite significant drop down in the frequency compared to its siblings because it has to stay within that power envelope. However, the differences here are more easily enough to match Intel in games, and even with an RTX 3080 at 1080p, the gains from its siblings are not so much to discount this CPU in terms of wanting the best all-round processor out there. So there's always going to be some compromises, and that does come at the expense of that all-core boost frequency, which, as I just mentioned, might have an impact in some benchmarks, perhaps in some games as well. So what we're seeing here then though is a CPU that in most other situations, if you're gaming at a higher resolution than 1080p with an RTX 3080, as soon as you start ramping up the resolution, the load tends to go more onto the graphics card than onto the processor, as I've done in the benchmarks, and basically you'll see it come into line with the other Ryzen 5000 series CPUs. That's not to dismiss its performance advantages over Intel though. The 10980XE just can't compete at all anywhere now. It's the only instance where it matched the new Ryzen CPU is in Handbrake when the Intel CPU was massively overclocked, and when it was so, it was drawing nearly double the amount of power from the wall at over 600 watts, which is insane. So what we've got here then is basically the new king of the hill. It's a no compromise product pretty much across the board in terms of gaming and content creation. It's pretty much awesome at everything. And that's a rare thing in the CPU world. Usually in the last few years, we've seen CPUs good at one or the other, but what we've got is a CPU here that is pretty much no compromise across the board, which is incredible. And for me, that kind of makes it worth the money. You know, it's $800, sure, but it's better than Intel at content creation, and it matches Intel or betters it in games as well. And that's spread across Intel's 2 platforms, its mainstream and high-end desktop. So that's an incredible achievement in my eyes. And even better is that this CPU is so power efficient, you can house it in motherboards such as this, the Crosshair 8 Impact or Mini ICX motherboards and that kind of thing. Building a small form factor PC, no problem with this CPU. Relatively easy to cool as well. So really what we've got here is an absolutely awesome product, but it was Zen 3, so we weren't expecting anything else, were we? So that's pretty much it from me. So thank you to AMD for providing the samples, and let me know in the comments if you decided to buy the Ryzen 9 5950X. Always interested to hear what people are doing with it, especially if it's a water-cooled PC or a small form factor PC. Obviously, I've got soft spots for those areas. And don't forget to check out my other reviews as well. I've already reviewed the 5900X, the 5800X and the 5600X as well. And I'll be doing plenty more coverage with those with some really cool builds over the next few months as well. So don't forget to subscribe to my channel, turn on notifications, and do like this video if it was informative too. So thanks for watching. Check out my other videos and I'll catch you soon.